Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the Volodar section of the front line where the Russians have made a breakthrough towards the road here in the east of Volodar, south of Vodiane. This has allowed the Russians to cut off the road at a second position. The first one further north would cut off the connection between Konstantinivka towards Vodiane and down to Volodar, and now the second one has cut off Vodiane as well. This leaves only a few roads near Volodar as supply roads towards the town, while the rest are now completely cut off with the Russian presence at the road. We see that the Russians recently on the 14th of August captured the final fortified positions, and this has allowed the Russians to then expand beyond that to the forest lines and launch an operation in between the two forest lines here in the central parts towards the road and gain a foothold on the other side of it. Taking a look at the topographic map, we can actually see that it is located at the low ground at an elevation of 150 meters. The Ukrainian fortified positions just north of it is located at 194 meters, so a 40 meter advantage. And down by Volodar it is about 197, so yet again about 40 meter difference. The Russians are fighting an uphill battle by advancing along the low ground, and they now have to switch towards the high ground positions of the Ukrainians by the fortified positions in the north and the fortified positions in the south by Volodar. Therefore, this is likely simply a cut off and incursion, gain a foothold to hit the supplies of the Ukrainians rather than an actual offensive operation to capture Vodiane or Volodar. Instead, this could actually be an attempt by the Russians to reach this road here to enter the coal plant and start fighting over that. To the further south, the Russians are now in a position where their frontline areas are similar to ahead of the Russian Volodar offensive, which took place about a year and 6 months ago. This offensive was widely discussed because it ended up spending dozens of vehicles and an entire brigade to achieve nothing. However, now that the Russians have significantly improved their positions in the east by gaining a foothold along the supply road, they will likely continue their operations north of Volodar in the direction of Vodiane before flanking Volodar from the north and cutting off additional roads to completely cut off the supply or mostly cut off the supply of the Ukrainians near Volodar. The roads have been limited to just a few. There is a couple here to the north, and then there's one to the south, very close to the front line. The one near the southern parts is naturally not being able to be used, as the Russians can hit that supply road constantly due to their proximate location to it. In the northern part, the Russians can now simply hold a lot of FPV drones in the northern parts to cover the entrance and exit of the Ukrainian vehicles. That means they can fly some around the fortified positions towards the rear, or from the central parts towards the rear, where they can overlook any supplies go in and out of Volodar and adjust artillery fire for them. Therefore, we can see that the current positions of the Russians near Volodar has been improved significantly, while the Ukrainian positions within the town and around it have become that much more difficult. Moving further north here in the direction of the Pokrovsk section of the front line, the Russians have made significant advances yet again. A small push here near Rodivka in the north, the full capture of Sherevka, and a push towards Krasny Yar and Kruchny Yar at the same time, capturing the forest line here west of Sherevka, taking advantage of their current momentum. They're pushing in every direction. To the south, they've pushed towards Selidove, reaching the first buildings of the suburbs of Selidove and the corresponding coal mine. If the Russians gain control over it, they will be able to slowly push down southwards Mikhailivka, and through the fortified positions further east, they will continue advancing along the high grounds towards the outskirts of Selidove. They will see that the Battle of Selidove may begin very soon. The Russians with this has also cut the highway here in between Pokrovsk and Karlivka. This is the main supply road towards Karlivka. It will now branch off into Selidove. But if the Russians continue pushing down south, capturing the fortified positions and pushing into Selidove, it will go much further along the railways, and then it will be pushed towards a much wider supply road compared to that which it was, and it will make it much more difficult for the Ukrainians to establish their positions in the east. If we take a look to measure the distance between the entrance of Pokrovsk down through the road which was initially used, we can see that it started out with a distance of about 30 kilometers at 32.7. Now the current road which they use is branching off near Selidove down south and then moved along this road, and this brings it to a similar distance of about 31.2. It may be shorter, but it has to go through the residential area, therefore it is more difficult than using the highway. Then the final road, which is what comes after Selidove, moving through the railway towards Surkurnie, and then further south along it towards Hrinik, before it can start moving further south towards Soriane, and then it starts moving north towards Shelene Pershe, and then up to Karlivka, and suddenly there's 12 additional kilometers to drive through, and they have to make a massive diversion from directly towards Karlivka from Pokrovsk. It'll be a massive way around just to reach the frontline town. At the same time, there are reports that the Ukrainians have started withdrawing from Skushne, Meshove, Komishivka, and Savitne, as the Russians have made heavy pressure in the northern parts, where they've managed to capture Shelene, and then following that, they much faster captured Novoshelene at a very fast pace, which this is leading to the Ukrainians simply being worried about an encirclement, and to avoid that, similar to the New York direction, they're withdrawing to positions where they can actually defend, and to strengthen the defenses near Selidove or in the direction of Novorodivka. The Russians this month have stepped up their offensive operations incomparably to the previous months. This is shown by the Russian advance completely outmatching that of previous months. To compare with concrete numbers, in the month of February, the Russians captured 90.4 square kilometers. With the collapse of the Avdiivka front, the full control over the city, and the following capture of Lostochkine, Sheverne, Orlivka, and a foothold in Tonenke, the Russians managed to capture about 90.4 square kilometers. In March, it ended up being about 20 square kilometers. In April, it was 52.8. In May, it was 60.4. It slowed down in June to 36.3. And in July, it was 64 square kilometers. So we saw that there was this general pace that peaked at around 60 square kilometers since the fall of Avdiivka, and the fall of Avdiivka itself was the 90.4 square kilometers. Comparatively, this month, in the first 17 days of July, the Russians have captured 64.7 square kilometers, on top of the recent developments, which is 4.2, 5.6, and 2.2, which all add up to about 77 square kilometers in total. This has already surpassed the months from March through July, and it is already close to surpassing the record, which was the Avdiivka collapse, which was 90 square kilometers. Therefore, we may be looking at over 100 square kilometers in a single month, based on the fact that there are still 14 days left of this month. This would eventually lead to the Russians fighting over Selidove, Novorodivka, Rodivka, Pokrovsk, and Martynovka in the next coming weeks, and this could lead to a significant worsening of the front line here in the Pokrovsk section of the front. The Russians captured these frontline towns, which I have been talking about this past month, Selidove, Novorodivka, and Rodivka. Then the front will move entirely in the direction of Pokrovsk along the third line of defense, which they, with the capture of Rodivka, have breached through towards Mirnorad, and further south, Selidove, the capture of which will lead to the Russians flanking all of the Ukrainian positions north of Kudahove by moving down south along the railways to completely physically cut off the entire village chain east of the Selidove positions and hitting their supplies directly. This would mean a complete encirclement of the Ukrainian positions here in the village chain, which would force them to withdraw or set up defensive position further north to stop and halt the Russian advance. However, it has not stopped for the past 6 months. Therefore, we can point towards that the Ukrainian lines are simply under so much pressure and there's no relief on the way. This just points to the Russian advance speeding up in the coming weeks rather than slowing down. And that is one of the greatest strengths of the Russian offensives, is that they launch offensive operations at a sustainable rate, while the Ukrainians do much more than they are able to sustain over a long period of time. The direction of Martynovka, the Russians have re-entered the northern parts of the town, leading to a reposition of the northern parts, as we see with the geolocated footage here. Russian forces were present in the first buildings and were hit by FPV drones, so we see that the Russians and the Ukrainians are doing positional fighting within the town itself. Further north in the direction of Pishana, there was a small advance just west of the town, as the Russians continue to improve their positions here west of the town to expand their zone of control along the forest patches here near the town, where the Ukrainians still have possessions within, and gaining control over those would leave nothing between the Russian positions by Pishana towards Koslivkivka, which would lead to only 2 crossings here in the north for every position of the Ukrainians east of the Uska River line, north of Kivka. And the reason for this is because the Russians would then be pushing towards the Uska River line from Pishane. This would cut off anything to the south of it, leaving the crossing right here and the crossing right here as the only crossings available for the Ukrainians, which would significantly limit supplies, especially if the Russians break the bridges. This will lead to only pontoon bridges being available for the Ukrainians, and with constant fire, it would limit the supplies even further, and that would lead to a Russian offensive operation here in the Kupiansk section of the front line. We see something similar here in the north, where the Ukrainians have cut off and blown the bridges in the same river, but they've blown them up here by Svanove and Glushkovko. They've also blown the ones here by the same river itself, where the Ukrainians simply have captured everything after a Russian withdrawal due to the blowing of the bridge. The main fighting is now taking place in Titkino for a Ukrainian push here in this section of the front line. The objective of the Ukrainians is to hit the bridges and cut off the supplies to force the Russians to withdraw from the fortified positions here south of the same river. However, the Russians have so far been setting up pontoon bridges similar to what the Ukrainians would be doing over the Uska River line, and therefore we see that the supplies are still there but limited, and the Ukrainians are constantly striking these bridges to completely limit it as much as possible. The Russians are simply making use of the wide area to continue setting up supplies, and the fact that they really do not have active operations in the area, leading to fewer supplies being spent, and based on that they're able to still have their stock available. So until the Ukrainians also hit their supplies, ammo depots and so on within the near front, they would be able to continue fighting. So we see that it has a significant impact on the Russian defenses in the area, but it doesn't mean that the Russians would simply withdraw or give up fighting due to it. Similarly to the Ukrainians by the Uska River line, there will be a heavy battle despite the supplies being cut. South of Kornevo, there is some positional fighting where the Ukrainians have pushed slightly back from Krasnochebrovsk, where the Ukrainians are now stationed around the railways. The objective here is to gain control over the flank from Kornevo down south to prevent supplies from going around the river line. The Ukrainian objective now is entirely focused on gaining control over this section of the front line, expanding the front line significantly, and having a strong flank to the south to focus all of the forces towards the Kornevo direction. So we see that an additional brigade from the Ukrainian armed forces have been introduced to deal with this section of the front line, forcing the Russians to redirect more forces, and again, with the bridges blown, that becomes more difficult. North of Sutsya, the Ukrainians have been geolocated in the northern parts of Martynovka, signaling their control over the village for the Ukrainians, and this means that the Russians and the Ukrainians are now doing positional fighting further north of Sutsya in the direction of Martynovka. Martynovka is fairly isolated from the rest of the towns, where it is located by itself. Following the Ukrainian capture of Mikhailovka, it was only a matter of time for them to capture Martynovka as well. And now this leads it to the Ukrainians being in a position where they can send further DRGs deeper into Russian lines. But with the recent Russian recapture of Kirkenskoye Poreshno, we see that the Russians do have a military presence in the area and could be launching local counterattacks to recapture these positions, similar to what we saw in the south, where the Russians managed to recapture Krupets and Kamyshona. So we see that positional fighting continues in the Kursk section of the front line, and this capture of Martynovka was actually the first Ukrainian advance in 3 days, which points towards the Russians having established front lines after the Ukrainians putting them constantly on the move and under heavy pressure for the past 2 weeks. But that is all for the developments over the past 24 hours. That's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.